Dachau concentration camps built by Nazi Germany and the longest-running one, opening on March 22, 1933. The camp was initially intended to intern Hitler's political opponents, which consisted of communists, social democrats, and other dissidents. It is located on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory northeast of the medieval town of Dachau, about 16 kilometers northwest of Munich in the state of Bavaria in southern Germany. After its opening by Heinrich Himmler, its purpose was enlarged to include forced labor and eventually the imprisonment of Jews, Romani, German and Austrian criminals, and finally, foreign nationals from countries that Germany occupied or invaded. The Dachau camp system grew to include nearly 100 subcamps, which were mostly work camps or Arbeitskommandos and were located throughout southern Germany and Austria. The main camp was liberated by US forces on April 29, 1945. Prisoners lived in constant fear of brutal treatment and terror detention, including standing cells, floggings, the so-called tree or pole, hanging, and standing at attention for extremely long periods. There were 32,000 documented deaths at the camp, and thousands that are undocumented. Approximately 10,000 of the 30,000 prisoners were sick at the time of liberation. In the post-war years, the Dachau facility served to hold SS soldiers awaiting trial. After 1948, it held ethnic Germans who had been expelled from Eastern Europe and were awaiting resettlement, and also was used for a time as a United States military base during the occupation. It was finally closed in 1960. There are several religious memorials within the memorial site, which is open to the public. After the takeover of Bavaria on March 9, 1933, Heinrich Himmler, then chief of police in Munich, began to speak with the administration of an unused gunpowder and munitions factory. He toured the site to see if it could be used for quartering protective custody prisoners. The concentration camp at Dachau was opened March 22, 1933, with the arrival of about 200 prisoners from Stadelheim prison in Munich and the Landsberg fortress. Himmler announced in the MNCHNR newest Nachrichten newspaper that the camp could hold up to 5,000 people and described it as the first concentration camp for political prisoners to be used to restore calm to Germany. It became the first regular concentration camp established by the coalition government of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and the German National People's Party. Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals and immigrants were sent to Dachau after the 1935 passage of the Nuremberg Laws, which institutionalized racial discrimination. In early 1937, the SS, using prisoner labor, initiated construction of a large complex capable of holding 6,000 prisoners. The construction was officially completed in mid-August 1938. More political opponents and over 11,000 German and Austrian Jews were sent to the camp after the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938. Sinti and Roma in the hundreds were sent to the camp in 1939, and over 13,000 prisoners were sent to the camp from Poland in 1940. Representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross inspected the camp in 1935 and 1938 and documented the harsh conditions. Dachau was opened in March 1933. The press statement given at the opening stated, "On Wednesday, the first concentration camp is to be opened in Dachau with an accommodation for 5,000 people. All communists and where necessary Reichsbahner and social democratic functionaries who endanger state security are to be concentrated here, as in the long run it is not possible to keep individual functionaries in the state prisons without overburdening these prisons. And on the other hand, these people cannot be released because attempts have shown that they persist in their efforts to agitate and organize as soon as they are released. Whatever the publicly stated purpose of the camp, the SS men who arrived there on May 11, 1933 were left in no illusion as to its real purpose by the speech given on that day by Johann Erasmus Freher von Molsen-Ponekow, comrades of the SS. You all know what the Führer has called us to do. We have not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings, as we are, but as second-class people. For years they have been able to continue their criminal existence. But now we are in power. If those pigs had come to power, they would have cut off all our heads. Therefore, we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear to see the blood of comrades, he does not belong and had better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed. Between the years 1933 and 1945, more than 3.5 million Germans were imprisoned in such concentration camps or prison for political reasons. Approximately 77,000 Germans were killed for one or another form of resistance by special courts, courts-martial, and the civil justice system. Many of these Germans had served in government, the military, or in civil positions, which were considered to enable them to engage in subversion and conspiracy against the Nazis. Medical experimentation. Hundreds of prisoners suffered and died or were executed in medical experiments conducted at KZ Dachau, of which Siegmund Rascher was in charge. Hypothermia experiments involved exposure to vats of icy water or being strapped down naked outdoors in freezing temperatures. Attempts at reviving the subjects included scalding baths and forcing naked women to have sexual intercourse with the unconscious victim. Nearly 100 prisoners died during these experiments. The original records of the experiments were destroyed in an attempt to conceal the atrocities. Extensive communication between the investigators and Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, documents the experiments. During 1942, high-altitude experiments were conducted. Victims were subjected to rapid decompression to pressures found at 4,300 meters and experienced spasmodic convulsions, agonal breathing, and eventual death. The camp was divided into two sections, the camp area and the crematorium. The camp area consisted of 32 barracks, including one for clergy imprisoned for opposing the Nazi regime and one reserved for medical experiments. The courtyard between the prison and the central kitchen was used for the summary execution of prisoners. The camp was surrounded by an electrified barbed wire fence, a ditch, and a wall with 7 guard towers. Prisoners' barracks in 1945 dot in early 1937, the SS, using prisoner labour, initiated construction of a large complex of buildings on the grounds of the original camp. The construction was officially completed in mid-August 1938 and the camp remained essentially unchanged and in operation until 1945. A crematorium that was next to, but not directly accessible from within the camp, was erected in 1942. KZ Dachau was there for the longest-running concentration camp of the Third Reich. The Dachau complex included other SS facilities beside the concentration camp, a leader school of the economic and civil service, the medical school of the SS, etc. The camp at that time was called a protective custody camp and occupied less than half of the area of the entire complex. In an effort to counter the strength and influence of spiritual resistance, Nazi security services monitored clergy very closely. Priests were frequently denounced, arrested, and sent to concentration camps, often simply on the basis of being suspected of activities hostile to the state or that there was reason to suppose that his dealings might harm society. Despite SS hostility to religious observance, the Vatican and German bishops successfully lobbied the regime to concentrate clergy at one camp and obtained permission to build a chapel for the priests to live communally and for time to be allotted to them for their religious and intellectual activity. Priests' barracks at Dachau were established in blocks 26, 28 and 30, though only temporarily. 26 became the international block and 28 was reserved for Poles, the most numerous group. The Nazis introduced a racial hierarchy, keeping Poles in harsh conditions, while favoring German priests. 697 Poles arrived in December 1941, and a further 500 of mainly elderly clergy arrived in October the following year. Inadequately clothed for the bitter cold of this group, only 82 survived. A large number of Polish priests were chosen for Nazi medical experiments. In November 1942, 20 were given phlegmons. 120 were used by Dr. Schilling for malaria experiments between July 1942 and May 1944. Several Poles met their deaths with the invalid trains sent out from the camp. Others were liquidated in the camp and given bogus death certificates. Some died of cruel punishment for misdemeanors, beaten to death or run to exhaustion. Satellite camps under the authority of Dachau were established in the summer and autumn of 1944 near armaments factories throughout southern Germany to increase war production. Dachau alone had more than 30 large subcamps and hundreds of smaller ones, in which over 30,000 prisoners worked almost exclusively on armaments. Overall, the Dachau concentration camp system included 123 subcamps and commandos, which were set up in 1943 when factories were built near the main camp to make use of forced labor of the Dachau prisoners. Out of the 123 subcamps, 11 of them were called Kaufering, distinguished by a number at the end of each. To specifically build 3 underground factories, Allied bombing raids made it necessary for them to be underground for a project called Ringeltorbo, which planned to be the location in which the German jet fighter plane Messerschmitt Me 262 was to be built. In the last days of war, in April 1945, the Kaufering camps were evacuated and around 15,000 prisoners were sent up to the main Dachau camp. Typhus alone was estimated to have caused 15,000 deaths between December 1944 and April 1945. Within the first month after the arrival of the American troops, 10,000 prisoners were treated for malnutrition and kindred diseases. In spite of this, 100 prisoners died each day during the first month from typhus, dysentery or general weakening. International Monument. The International Monument was inaugurated on September 8, 1968. It was designed by Nandor Glid, who himself was persecuted as a Jew by the Nazis in his home country of Yugoslavia and had joined the resistance to the German occupation forces at the end of 1944. The sculptor won a competition organized by the CID, the association representing the survivors, in 1959. Part of the extension work on the camp in 1937/38 included guard installations designed to make escape from the prisoner camp impossible. As the grounds were turned into a refugee camp in 1948, the camp fence and one guard tower were removed. In the 1960s, with the developing of the area into the memorial site, the missing guard tower was reconstructed, while the remaining towers, in part in a state of dilapidation, were restored. In their absolute desperation, those prisoners, no longer able to endure living in constant fear under the SS regime of terror, chose to die. They deliberately entered the neutral zone or threw themselves against the high-voltage barbed wire fence. Sometimes the SS guards forced prisoners onto the prohibited area and then shot them because they were allegedly trying to escape. As part of the expansions made to the camp in 1937/38, the SS had a complex of 34 barracks built, comprised of 4 functional and 30 accommodation barracks. The complex was then demolished in 1960 for 65ths. The 2 structures today located where the former camp road began are replicas erected in 1965. The reconstructed barrack on the eastern side features an exhibition on the accommodation and living conditions of the prisoners. Concrete foundations cast in 1965 mark the positions of the other 32 barracks. Each of the prisoner barracks, also known as block in the language of the camp, was divided into 4 rooms. Each of these rooms was in turn made up of day quarters furnished with tables, stools and lockers, as well as sleeping quarters with wooden bunk beds. The prisoners were defenseless against the brutal despotism of the SS block leaders, who bullied them with strict and minute regulations on the cleanliness of the floors, how things were to be arranged in the lockers, or how the beds were to be made. Even the slightest of deviations from the draconian standards was severely punished. Each of the accommodation barracks was designed to hold 200 persons. Towards the end of the war, the barracks were full to overflowing, however, with up to 2,000 prisoners crammed into a barrack. Located in the first barrack on the left of the camp road were the canteen, the camp orderly room, the library, and the SS museum, as well as instruction rooms for the prisoner personnel. On the right of the camp road was the sick bay, which was continually extended to include more barracks given the disastrous state of the prisoners' health. Behind the sick bay were the punishment blocks and quarantine barracks for the newly arrived prisoners. Catholic Mortal Agony of Christ Chapel was the first religious memorial erected at the northern end of the former campgrounds. The functional buildings of the concentration camp located here were demolished in the 1950s and 1960 seconds. The Dachau survivor and later auxiliary bishop of Munich, Johannes Neuhausler, initiated the building of the Mortal Agony of Christ Chapel. The chapel was consecrated on August 5, 1960 during the Eucharistic World Congress. Designed by the architect Joseph Wiedmann, the open cylindrical structure faces the central axis of the former camp. Above the entrance is a crown of thorns made of iron. Symbolically, the structure stands for the liberation from captivity through Christ. The memorial bell in front of the chapel rings out once a day shortly before 3 p.m., the hour of Jesus' death as depicted in the Bible. On August 20, 1962, the Dachau survivor and later Archbishop of Suceck and Kami, Kazimierz Majdarski, unveiled a bronze likeness of Christ and a trilingual dedication honoring the Polish prisoners, the largest prisoner group in the Dachau concentration camp. Carmel Holy Blood. The monastery, built by Joseph Wiedmann and consecrated in 1964, houses a community of around 20 sisters from the Order of Discalced Carmelites. It is located directly on the north side next to the grounds of the Dachau concentration camp memorial. The church also contains the grave of Auxiliary Bishop Johannes Neuhäusler, who, as a former special prisoner, was the main initiator of the construction of the Agony of Christ Chapel. Jewish Memorial. On May 7, 1967, the Regional Association of the Israelite Communities in Bavaria unveiled a Jewish memorial. Designed by ZVI Gutmann, the parabola-shaped structure features a ramp that leads downward, reminding visitors of the extermination of European Jews. At its lowest point, light shines into the memorial through an opening. A menorah, a 7-branched candelabrum made of marble from Pekion, is positioned on the top of the structure. The town of Pekion in Israel symbolizes the continuity of Jewish life. The crematorium area is the central memorial site of the Dachau concentration camp memorial. Immediately after the liberation, the area was used to commemorate the dead. In the 1960s, it was redesigned to resemble a cemetery. Today, access to the crematorium area is via a bridge from the former prisoner camp. This does not correspond to the historical situation because the area, which was partly covered with trees, was in the SS camp, was surrounded by a wall and was strictly separated from the prisoner camp. Only SS officials and prisoners who had to cremate the bodies were allowed access. Initially, the SS gave the ashes of prisoners who died in the camp to their relatives, buried the bodies not far from the camp, or took them to Munich's Eastern Cemetery for cremation. When the number of prisoners and the death rate rose sharply with the start of the war, the SS had the first crematorium with an incineration oven built in the summer of 1940. Just 1 year later, the crematorium's capacity was no longer sufficient. Therefore, construction of Barrack X began in the spring of 1942, and it was put into operation a year later. It contained a crematorium with 4 incineration ovens, disinfection chambers for clothing, lounge and sanitary rooms, as well as death chambers and a gas chamber disguised as a shower bath. There is no doubt that Barrack X was designed for the mass extermination of prisoners. There was no mass killing of people by poison gas in the Dachau concentration camp. It is unclear why the SS did not use the functioning gas chamber in this way. According to a contemporary witness report, some prisoners were killed by poison gas in 1944. The SS also used the secluded crematorium area as an execution site. Prisoners were hanged here or shot in the back of the neck. The victims were mainly members of resistance organizations. A path known as the Path of Death leads past execution sites and ash graves. Between 1933 and 1945, around 41,500 people died in the Dachau concentration camp and its subcamps from hunger, exhaustion and disease, as well as from torture and murder.